Hello and welcome to another episode of Only Books in the Building. I'm your host, Emma Nichols, and here with me today is our co-host,
Juliet Rosenberg,
and our guest speakers,
Lila,
Lindsay,
Grace or Grayson.
Now, today's topic is dystopian, and I know there's a lot that goes into dystopian books. So what do you guys think makes a book categorized as dystopian?
Well, I think there's many factors. It includes a controlling government, and it includes loss of freedoms also to people.
Yeah, I would say anything where human suffering is really exaggerated. So I know when I read lots of dystopian, it's a lot of times government control, but I also think extreme war in some cases and stuff like that can be considered dystopian.
Yeah, sometimes post-apocalyptic. Yeah. Also, it's the opposite of utopia. It was an attempt at utopia, but it didn't go right. They're trying to make peace, but it wasn't really peace.
Yeah, there's also always some division amongst the people. In Divergent, there's the factions, and then I think in Hunger Games, isn't there some?
There are districts, yeah. I think another part of that is that the individuals within those districts and sections and factions, they all kind of lose a sense of their individuality, and they're forced to conform to those roles of that specific district or section, and so they're basically told who they are before they can find it out themselves. So I think that's also a contributing factor.
Yeah. In Divergent, they have specific clothes they need to wear, all Daltons supposed to wear black and stuff. When we find out in the last book, it's because of their DNA. There's DNA genetic mutations, which made them to have specific qualities, and then the Divergent are the ones that have healed from those.
So the Divergent are the only true humans out of all of them. All the rest of them have something wrong.
Genetically pure, I think is what they call them. They're genetically damaged and genetically pure. So they did tests to try to amplify good traits and decrease bad traits, but they ended up making a person just one thing.
So what are some of your favorite dystopian novels?
Ooh, I think for so growing up, I of course loved Hunger Games and the Divergent especially. I mean, I think now I see that Hunger Games and was one of the best dystopian books, but at the time Divergent was my favorite. I really also loved Shatter Me, and recently the other day I just read a dystopian novel called The Memory Police, which is about it's a unnamed island in an unnamed place where all objects that are considered a portion of a past government are removed, and so a novelist is trying to figure out how to still write when so many words and so many things she can't talk about. Yeah, I would say Shatter Me is one of my favorites.
Yeah, other than the ones we already mentioned, I also like Maze Runner, the Legend series, and also Scythe.
Yeah, my aunt really wanted me to read Scythe a couple years back, and I think I started it. But one book I really liked that my entire class didn't was Animal Farm. That one was a weird mix of dystopian, but also not. It had the obvious division.
It was about communism.
Yeah.
But on a farm.
It was a metaphor for communism.
We actually we read that in 8th grade, and we really talked about how it was very metaphorical to Russia, and specifically Russia. And I personally found Animal Farm very creepy, especially the ending. It really got me. Going back to favorite dystopian books, I would say probably Legend, specifically Champion. I feel the last one was pretty good, although I do just favor the third book in pretty much every series.
Oh, for talking about creepy endings, I think 1984 was kind of because he conforms to the societal the government. He stops fighting back and he just gives into it.
Right. It was scary to see how he did have that he finally found that sense of freedom and self, and he was trying to explore that, and it felt at the moment when he was at his most his self and he was getting most comfortable, and I think at the point where he maybe would have sought more revolution, that's when they really baited him with O'Brien, and I guess I don't know, it felt like they did something didn't they torture him into yeah. Oh, is that what it's from? The rats.
Yeah, okay, so what she's talking about is there's a saying where it's crazy, I was crazy once, they put me in a rubber room with rats, the rats made me crazy. And we were talking about this a couple weeks ago on the bus, how that ties in so closely to what happened at the end of 1984.
Well, I think they put rats in a cage and put on his face because they also had technology to know what his deepest fears were. And then he ended up putting those fears on his girlfriend because he couldn't take them himself.
Yeah, 1984 is very messed up. Like, even from the beginning, his whole like, rebellion isn't so much as a rebellion as, like, everyone knew what he was doing already.
Yeah, he's not your typical protagonist.
Yeah, no, I also feel like the typical like dystopian factor of it, where the main conflict is the fighting and it is the war and it is the government, wasn't there because it was so focused on him and Julia. Like almost the entire book. Like the beginning focused a little bit more on the government and what they were doing wrong and how he was working for them but he didn't want to work for them and things like that. But then like he met Julia, tried to kill her with a brick, and then decided like, never mind, like I'll focus on her more, and the rebellion like phase of it almost kind of faded away.
Yeah, but it is interesting to have a protagonist that isn't a 16-year-old girl, like a different kind of protagonist.
Yeah, I actually had the chance to grow up in that society, and he spent, I guess, I want to say like 30-ish years as an acting member. His job was to like erase parts of history, and he did that for years. And I wonder like if he reached that point where like he reached like full, self-independency and stuff, would he like how he would feel to like look back on his past. And it would have been really cool to see his recovery from that. He did escape from that sort of government.
Yeah. Like kind of going off of that, what makes like our favorite dystopian novels dystopian? Like what factors of the book make it dystopian instead of just like fiction?
Well, like the Legend series, I know it's kind of more in like a futuristic setting, which I feel like more like dystopian books kind of take place in some alternate time, specifically more future. But other than that, like they mentioned kind of how there was like more advanced technology and like there was a war. So like those elements also go towards like what makes dystopian.
Yeah, no, I think that's the same for like Divergent, where it's like a different, I forget exactly when it's supposed to be set, but it's very obviously not set in like a current day setting. And then there's a division amongst them caused by the government, whom no one likes.
And beyond that government, there's a higher government who put them all there in the first place, where they established order, and then it fell apart.
And I definitely think it like plays on like modern fears for the future. And like the revolution, they're fighting against something that people think of today, like corrupt government, stuff like that.
In terms of like dystopian worlds and what authors' goals are when they write the book, I find that a lot of authors, dystopian authors specifically, bring in parts of the real world and intertwine it with aspects of their dystopian books. And for example, 1984 was inspired by George Orwell's experiences in the Spanish Civil War and Europe's political state after World War II. And we see that a lot in his setting, which is in London, and it's all over in the book.
Yeah, a good question to like kind of play off of that would be like, how do the dystopian worlds in the book resemble what is going on in the world at the time that the author writes it? Because I feel like that's a big thing, is that the events that are going on in the real world when the author is writing this book influence their ideas of how they want to write the book, how they want it to be like set, the characters, like it influences a lot.
Well, I feel like influence can be taken from like some communist states of present day, but also from like past. We think about like French revolutions, where it was like very bloody and stuff, and they wanted like complete change in their government, which I feel like could be kind of like dystopian, could be based off of some of those things that happened.
I think another good example of this is the book We. I don't think it's very well known here at this point in time, but it was basically the precursor to A Brave New World and 1984. And there's so many connections between 1984 and We, but it takes a more science fiction perspective on it. But the author is Yevgeny Zamyatin, and he was a part, like he was growing up, he grew up in the Soviet Union when it was the Soviet Union. I think it was like he wrote this book in the 1920s, so it was around that time when, communism was pretty prevalent in that area. And because of that, he couldn't publish his book in Russia or where he was living in the Soviet Union at that time, and he had to export it or like smuggle it into different countries, so it was published there first. And that's how George Orwell was also kind of inspired and took notes from what he did.
That's so interesting. I didn't know that.
So we have like a list here of other dystopian books that we like found pretty interesting. Have any of you read Red Queen? Can someone tell me what that's about? Because I started it but I never finished it.
So basically, Red Queen, it's a quartet. It's of novels, and it so basically it is set in the society where there are people who are red bloods, and they're considered like the common people. Many of them are on the poorer side, and then there's silver bloods who are considered like the elite population. They're higher ups, they're royalty, and they also have powers. And so the protagonist, Mare Barrow, she is a red blood. She lives with her family, and then one day she meets the prince of the Silvers. He invites her to his palace for a job, and then she finds out that she kind of has these powers that no red-blooded person has, and kind of everything changes from there.
So it still has that like sensation of there's a division due to like some uncontrollable like feature.
And then the rest of the novels definitely take on like the war revolution side. As they find out kind of what is going on, there's more people who identify with it, and then it definitely becomes like a fight for equality, which I thought was really cool.
I think that happens with a lot of dystopian books where by the end of it it's more like it's less of what the argument was before where it's like going against the government, and it's more so them realizing like this society is not what we want it to look like. It's not fair. Like people are treated differently just because of something that they can't even control. Like we want to change that. Like that's how I think that's how it kind of was in Divergent specifically, was like by the end of it was less of like we want to go against these people. It was very much like we don't want to be in the factions. We want to like be one community. I think that's another factor of dystopian books is that there's always some hidden like truth that the government has concealed from the people to like force them to live under these insane circumstances.
Yeah, I feel like misinformation and propaganda is especially prevalent in dystopian books, and especially in books such as 1984 and We, which do definitely take that more political side of the dystopian book genre. But the misinformation in 1984 was that they all were working together. War is peace. It had those, counteracting slogans and stuff.
2 + 2 is 5.
Yeah, they had those sorts of things, and they built their society off of that misinformation. So to get rid of that would have been like destructing the whole thing. And in We, they treated dreams like psychedelic diseases, and hunger was eradicated. So they had to eat petroleum products, but they normalized it to such a degree that it was like unfreedom is the peak society.
Yeah, basing like going off that unfreedom thing, is that like they can't like really miss what they don't know. Like if these people have grown up in society, they don't understand that what they're doing is like not right. Like we think it's so crazy that like the Hunger Games would even exist, but like that's something they go through, and like they're used to it.
Yeah. Have any of you read the book Fourth Wing? So I know in Divergent they have like the factions. Each faction is known for something different. It's the same thing with Fourth Wing. They have the different like quadrants. So they're like scribes. There are healers, the writers. Is there one more? I think because like it's quadrants, but they're well the main ones are scribes, writers, and healers, and like there is like a dystopian factor to it because later in the book, and like spoiler alert, it comes out that the like the royalty and the leaders had been hiding from the people the entire time, the dangerous like creatures and magic that existed outside of their little like dome of safety, because they have this ward that protects them from everything outside of the border, but outside the border they were lying about how dangerous it really could be. And this girl, like the main girl, Violet, she is on like a mission out there, and she discovers it, and she realizes that her entire life has been a lie, and her mom just so happens to be like one of the bigger writers. She is like very well known. She's in control of a lot of things, and so she doesn't know what to do because her mom has been raising her in this lie this entire time. And so it has like all the factors, well, some of the factors of dystopian books, but like do we think it's a dystopian book? Like does it get categorized as that, or is it fantasy?
You know, it definitely it has the big fantasy elements, like obviously dragons and stuff like that. But I think the premise is very similar to dystopian, and kind of like you've been brainwashed to think some way your entire life, and when you realize that like this thing is hurting the people, not helping them, finding a way to revolt and, like as Lila was saying, like free the people almost.
Yeah, I think another dystopian book that's like kind of like in between is like book Scythe, because there isn't, that one didn't like take place like we're saying after like a war or an apocalypse. I think this society has always had these like Grim Reaper type people, and that was just how it was.
At least like for the majority of their history, that's how it had been.
Yeah, I don't think like any of them could recall like not that.
Yeah, because then there's also the element in Scythe where it's like if you kiss the ring, you get like it's like a free pass to life pretty much for I forget how long. Like I know if you kiss the ring of a scythe, then you get like life for like they can't come after you for anything for it's either like forever or for like a really long time, like a good couple of years at least. So like it has that element to it, and then the two kids I know are taken under the scythe's wing as like the trainees. Yeah.
I think an outlier in the dystopian books might be Maze Runner in terms of what we were talking about with like things being a certain way for so long, people not remembering what it was like before these inhumane laws or these restrictions. But Maze Runner, it was just a bunch of kids who were literally brainwashed by Wicked and thrown into a maze with like no prior recollection.
Yeah, they did lose their memories when they did that, and like they had this like goal to escape, but I think when the book started, it had only been like 2 years since they had started coming there. I think Newt was the oldest and he was there for 2 years, so yeah. And then they had these like grievers, so like grievers were trying to like kill them, or they went through the changing where they would like remember things, and these things were like also like relating to the giver, like these things of the real world, like the world we know, like they're so bad to them because they don't know these things, like war and stuff, like Jonas was seeing the giver when he was through whatever he was going through training.
Speaking of the giver had a really interesting aspect by taking away color vision, because I feel like for people who just have color vision and have had it all their life, like the fact of waking up and not having it would be appalling, and for him to like kind of recognize that and take that into this world is something I haven't really seen from any other book, despite my not liking of the giver. So
I think that goes into like the dystopian quality of making everyone equals and not giving them their individuality.
Yeah, it's like taking away something that makes them unique, like how they view the world. It's like people who are colorblind see the colors differently or not at all, but that also gives them that sense of like, this is how I see things compared to how you see things. But then by completely taking that away and everyone just sees black and white like it was an old movie or something like that, that's making them very like, this is what we all see. Like there's nothing.
Another thing about the givers, their parents weren't actually their parents. They would like each like family unit was assigned like 2 kids eventually, and so like there are just people whose job was to give birth to babies. So, and their jobs were also chosen for them. Another like dystopian thing, like they didn't have that choice.
So why do we think that not having choice is such a big factor of dystopian? Like what does that cause within those worlds?
I feel like the lack of free will kind of gives way to the urge to rebel. Like, personally, I did a presentation on free will for 1984 last year, and we talked about how kind of like Winston, the reason why he started like writing in the journal and then going out and like getting a girlfriend was because he wasn't allowed to. And so like the lack of freedom and the ability to do things he wanted inspired people, including Winston, to go and do those things.
And there's still always that like underlying like written rule sort of thing where if you can't do something, it's gonna make you want to do it more. So okay, to kind of like wrap things up here, what do you think could be changed about dystopian books to make them more of the fantasy and less of the like lack of choice and like dystopian books that they are?
Yeah, I think there's some controversy about dystopian books saying they're like have these similar qualities, which I know a lot of them do, but I think they are also very unique. But like it's like we could lean away from that one controlling monarch government who, yeah.
Like every dystopian book has the same exact factor.
Also, like we talked about earlier, like more diverse protagonists.
Like in our last episode, we talked about movie adaptations, and we were talking about the new Percy Jackson series, how they completely flipped what the books wrote about the characters, and how they like changed some things to make it a little bit different, a little bit more diverse, and to include more of like modern day like
Don't
things.
listen to that. Go check it out.
Yes, definitely. So, now that we've discussed dystopian books, why do we think dystopian books are so popular? Like whenever something happens in the world, it's like when COVID happened, they got more popular again. It's like whenever some bad event happens, why do we think they come back?
Probably because they're more relatable than fantasy or sci-fi. It's like sci-fi, to be honest, is just too scientific for me at least. So people probably didn't want to like read full-on essays about worlds, and they probably didn't want to be introduced to a completely new one with a bunch of different new like creatures and plants and whatnot. But dystopian are like, you have the basis of like a similar world to what we have, just kind of with different governments, which very applicable to today's worlds, and then like wars, which also very applicable. And so they're like relatable but still different enough for us to want to read them.
Yeah, like people like they want to escape from the world and everything that's going on, but they like in dystopian they can still see aspects of their world, but and understand these like underlying problems, but it's not like the exact same, which still offers them that escape factor that's like makes it so entertaining.
And I know that sometimes when I read, it helps me better understand like the world around me, if that makes sense. Like sometimes, like if something happens, I'm like, oh, like I think of a book or something, and so it kind of like is another way for me to see different perspectives or validate the feelings that I'm feeling at the time.
Yeah, reading makes you smarter.
For sure.
Like it also brings to light like more emotion that you didn't even like recognize, but then you read the main like character going through that and you're like, wait, like that resembles a lot of what I'm dealing with. So thank you for listening to this episode of Only Books in the Building. We had so much fun making this. If you want to listen to us, follow us on Instagram, YouTube. Our podcast is up on Podbean, Spotify, and I believe Amazon Music. So thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.